Once I'm finished, we can have questions and answers. I'd like you to open your Bibles this afternoon to Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17. We're going to look at this very quickly, but I want to lay some very important groundwork here. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, There came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now we know from Scripture, from a host of passages, Isaiah 1, 20, 21, Jeremiah 3, 6 through 8, Ezekiel 16, verses 15 through 30, the entire book of Hosea. The symbol of an impure woman in the Bible represents an apostate church. And all those verses I just mentioned, if you go back and look them up, you'll find that whenever God's people went into apostasy, they were called an impure woman, a whore, a harlot, etc. So we're dealing here in Revelation 17 with an apostate church, and verse 2 says that the kings of the earth have committed fornication with this great whore. And when we think of the word, the kings of the earth, we're talking here about presidents, prime ministers, dictators, world leaders. That's what we're talking about. So Revelation 17, 1 and 2 states that the great apostate church, which is the Roman Catholic Church system, is united together with the leaders of our world. Now, let's bring it right down home. Who are some of the leaders in our world today? Tony Blair of England. Is Tony Blair united to the Catholic Church? Is England united to Rome? Revelation 17:2 says yes. That's what Revelation 17:2 says. The kings of the earth are committing fornication with the Roman Catholic Church system. How about Putin of Russia? Is Russia united to the papacy? According to Revelation 17:2, Russia is. How about Yasser Arafat of the PLO? Revelation 17:2 says yes, he is. How about Ariel Sharon, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, the leader of South Korea, and I don't remember his name right off. This verse right here says that the leaders of our world today are united with and doing the bidding of the Catholic Church. Now, how about George Bush? Is George Bush united with the Roman Catholic Church? Is he doing the bidding of Rome? Yes, he is. Yes, he is. His brother is too, up there in Tallahassee. Absolutely. Now let's take a look for just a moment. Right now in our world today, George Bush and the United States government is putting tremendous pressure on Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government. Correct? And it appears as though they are mortal enemies. But who are they both working for? They're both working for the Catholic Church. Because Revelation 17:2 says, the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. So Saddam Hussein is doing exactly what his Jesuit advisors are telling him to do. And George Bush is doing exactly what his Jesuit advisors are telling him to do. Now, what are they doing? Saddam Hussein is allowing UN people to come in and analyze what he has, Or that's what the media tells us, right? But on the other hand, George Bush is saying, oh no, he can't be trusted. We can't trust this guy. And no matter what happens, sooner or later, we're going to go in and sack this guy because he can no longer stay in power. Now, isn't that what we're hearing? But according to Revelation 17:2, the Jesuits and the Catholic Church are telling Bush and Hussein exactly what to do. And they're fulfilling their role as the papacy's puppets. They're doing exactly what they're told. So Saddam Hussein is being made out to appear as though he's cooperative. And George Bush now is made out to appear as the aggressor. And I read in the Orlando Sentinel just this last week where many people in the world, many world leaders are bothered by George Bush's aggressiveness. They think George Bush should back off. And they're bugged that he keeps pushing the issue. So what's going to happen in all this? What's going to happen? How is it that there's going to be a war? You know Albert Pike? He was the Illuminati leader. He was a general in the Civil War for the South, for the Confederate Army. And as the head of the Illuminati, Albert Pike said there would be 3 great wars in the 20th century. Now, there have only been 2, haven't there? But we're on the brink of that 3rd great war. Now, how is it going to start? If Saddam Hussein is going to turn out to be lily white, and it appears so at this point, but George Bush continues to drive it, what's going to be the catalyst? How is it going to be brought about that there would be another war? How is George Bush going to finally get the excuse he needs to go to war with Iraq? How's he going to do it? To answer that question, I want us to look at what America, or how America has been brought into the other wars in the 20th century. How America was brought into World War I and how America was brought into World War II. And if we understand that, then we can tell, based on what happened there, what's going to happen soon. Let's look at it this afternoon. And I call this one Behind the Door Part 21, or the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, and What's Ahead. Now, a little bit of background about World War I. Up to that point in American history, America had never fought in a war across the Atlantic Ocean. Never fought in a war across the Atlantic. The Americans had followed the Monroe Doctrine that the Europeans could fight their wars and America would deal with her problems in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine said. Never was America to become embroiled or involved in any European or foreign wars. This was very strong in the United States prior to World War I. But in 1914, when the Archduke Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo, things began to change. World War I opens, 1914. The great goal of the war, the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church wanted a global government. They wanted a League of Nations. Because they knew when they had a world government, they could use it to rule the world. In order for this to occur, all the great powers of earth had to suffer the great horrible pangs of war. Only then would they clamor for and agree to a world government. You see, folk, and this plays out again. The Jesuit order, before World War I was ever fought, they knew exactly what the war was designed for. If you get people involved in a war and there's enough bloodshed and enough broken hearts and enough crying mothers because they've lost their children, if somebody then comes along in the controlled press and introduces to you, let's have a League of Nations that's going to bring world peace, what's everybody going to do? They're going to say, that's the answer! That's the answer! And they're going to embrace it. Now, after this war that's going to be fought with America and Iraq and other powers, do you know what the Jesuit goal is? If there's enough bloodshed in the Middle East, and there's enough people that die from all countries, then the controlled press is going to say, you know what? In order so we'll never have another war in the Middle East, we need to bring a peacemaker to that part of the world. And if we have a peacemaker set up in Jerusalem, the city of peace, we'll never have another war. And so who will be brought forward as the great man of peace to rule the world from Jerusalem? The Pope. So there's a distinct and definite goal that they have outlined for the war that will begin sometime in the future. Definite plan. So the Archduke to the Austrian-Hungarian throne is shot in Sarajevo in August 26, 1914. Everybody begins to take sides, just as the papacy knew they would, because the Catholic Church controlled all the powers of Europe. They knew that as soon as this man was shot, that Austria-Hungary would go against the Serbs, the Orthodox of that country. And if that happened, then Russia would come on the side of the Orthodox, and England and France, they would all get together and support the Serbs. And the Austria-Hungarians knew as soon as they fired their first shot, the Germans, the Italians, and the Spaniards would immediately come to their aid. So all the major powers of Europe, as soon as one shot was fired, they all lined up. Just as the Jesuit order had planned it. But there was one missing piece of the puzzle as the war began in 1914, and that was a sleeping giant on the other side of the Pacific. When the war broke out in 1914, the only major power in the world that did not join in was the United States of America. How could America be brought into a war? The American people didn't want it. Woodrow Wilson had become president in the election of 1912, and with World War I well underway, and his re-election bid coming on, you know how Woodrow Wilson got back into office in 1916? This is the ticket he ran on. I have kept you out of war. Your boys have not been killed. Therefore, vote for me. You see? So he used it and said, I've kept you out of war. Vote for me now. Now, it's very, very interesting that at the very time that Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for re-election and telling people to vote for me because I've kept you out of war, his major assistant by the name of Edward Mandell House, who was also known as the Holy Monk, who also had strong connections to the Rothschilds in Europe, and by the way, the Rothschilds are controlled by the Jesuit order. Edward Mandell House, as a Jesuit agent in the White House, is secretly planning to get America into World War I. Now, if you don't have this book, you need to get this one too. The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Griffin shows that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I think I'll be reading that to you momentarily. This is another great book called Descent into Slavery by Des Griffin. Tremendous book. I want to read to you, though, from this book on page 101. It says this: although Wilson and his hidden masters had been planning for American military involvement in the European theater of war, there was one major obstacle that had to be overcome. The overwhelming majority of the American people were isolationist in their outlook. They wanted their country to adhere to the time-honored principles of the Monroe Doctrine and not to become involved in a European war. As the hypocritical puppet president was up for re-election in 1916, he was forced to go through the motions of being on the side of the American people during his bid for a second term. Under the slogan, "He kept us out of war," Wilson barely won re-election. But within a few days of his inauguration for a second term, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson, as Des Griffin brings out, he was a puppet of the Jesuits who controlled the White House. And in fact, after Woodrow Wilson's plans failed for a League of Nations, and he realized that in so doing, to try to get a League of Nations, he was betraying the American people. They say that when he got back from Europe, Woodrow Wilson became an imbecile. He lost his mind because he realized he was betraying the American people. And he also had syphilis. Now, G. Edward Griffin's book, Creature from Jekyll Island, page 241. He's quoting from a book by George Variac called The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Edward Mandell House. And it's on page 241 of his book. This is what he says. It says, 10 months before the election, which returned Wilson to the White House in 1916, because he kept us out of war, Colonel Edward Mandell House negotiated a secret agreement with England and France on behalf of Wilson, which pledged the United States to intervene on behalf of the Allies. Now, what is this guy saying? Simply this. Woodrow Wilson is standing up and saying, "Vote for me, I kept you out of war." And while he's saying that in America, Edward House, as Wilson's representative in Europe, is working with England and France to bring America into World War I. Now that's what was going on. And so right now, let's bring that down to today. Right now, we have all this stuff going on in the press that Saddam Hussein is so compliant and willing to work and to let the UN inspectors in, and George Bush is being the aggressor. Now that's what we're being led to see. But you know what's really going on behind the scenes? They're simply preparing the world mind for the events that are about to happen. That's what's happening, folks. They're preparing, they're getting the stage all set for what they have planned to happen very shortly. And they know exactly what they're going to do. Just as Wilson and House and Winston Churchill knew way back in 1914 and 1915. So how did Woodrow Wilson, Edward Mandell House, and Winston Churchill, how did they get America into the war? How would you bring a nation that said, we don't want to go to war, we don't want to have anything to do with it, How are you going to get America involved? You know how you do it? You create some event whereby a certain number of American people are hurt or killed. And then the public opinion in America will say, they're terrible. Look what they did to Americans. And so then what will Americans say to do? We've got to defend democracy. We've got to defend freedom. And so then we'll go to war against those awful people who would kill Americans. Have you heard about that? It's happened here, hasn't it? Well, you know what? September 11th, 2001 was not the first time it happened. There was a terrorist attack that the President of the United States, his top advisors, among whom were Edward Mandell House and others, Winston Churchill of England, they were planning a terrorist attack where Americans would die and then America would go to war. What would they use? In 1915, they used a British passenger liner called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was built to be a luxury liner, but it was made so that it could be turned into a ship for war if necessary. In G. Edward Griffin's book, again, The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 248, he says this. He says, the Lusitania became one of the most important carriers of war materials, including munitions from the United States to England. So what was happening was the British were using this so-called passenger liner called the Lusitania. But what they were doing is they'd take British people over to America, but on the return trip to England, they would fill it with supplies to be able to fight the war. And in fact, it says here in the book, on March 8, 1915, after several close calls with German submarines, the captain of the Lusitania turned in his resignation. He was willing to face the U-boats, he said, but he was no longer willing to carry the responsibility of mixing passengers with munitions or contraband. He goes on, he says, from England's point of view, the handwriting on the wall was clear. Unless the United States could be brought into the war as her ally, she soon would have to sue for peace. The challenge was how to push Americans off their position of stubborn neutrality. How that was accomplished is one of the more controversial aspects of the war. And so the Lusitania was carrying war materials along with English and American passengers. So what would happen if the Lusitania has war materials on board and it has Americans and British passengers on board, and it's making its way across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's in international waters, and it's heading toward the British Isles, and there's German submarines in the waters. And the German submarines say, halt. And what happens if the Lusitania doesn't halt? And what happens if the Lusitania is not protected? What would happen? if a German submarine would then shoot a torpedo at the Lusitania and all the Americans on board were killed, what do you think would be heard in the press? What do you think the people would say? They'd say, look at how awful the Germans are. Look what they did to us. And then Woodrow Wilson would have all the artillery he needed to go to Congress and say, we need to declare war on Germany. It's the Germans' fault. That's right. When in actuality, it was the Americans and English leaders that planned the whole thing. The whole thing. Winston Churchill, who was the head of the English Navy at that time, he had a high position.
Secretary of the Admiralty.
Okay, Secretary of the Admiralty. He deliberately exposed the Lusitania to German submarines who would torpedo her, killing the passengers, and to stir America to war. In fact, in Winston Churchill's own book, and it's quoted in Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 248, this is what Winston Churchill said in his book called The World Crisis, page 300. Churchill said, there are many kinds of maneuvers in war. There are maneuvers in time, diplomacy, mechanics, psychology, all of which are removed from the battlefield but react often decisively upon it. The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is as serviceable as that which wins a great battle. The maneuver which gains an important strategic point may be less valuable than that which placates or overawes a dangerous neutral. And then over here, let's see here, 274, yeah. He says this, after the Lusitania was torpedoed, he says, the first British counter-move made on my responsibility was to deter the Germans from surface attack. The submerged U-boat had to rely increasingly on underwater attack and thus ran the greater risk of mistaking neutral for British ships and of drowning neutral crews and thus embroiling Germany with other great powers. Now, it's very interesting. The German government knew that Britain was trying to use the Lusitania as a target to let her be blown up and then to create American public opinion into bringing America into the war. The Germans knew that. And so, the Imperial German Embassy, April 22nd, 1915, about 2 weeks before the Lusitania was going to set sail, the German embassy wanted to put an ad in the newspapers on the East Coast to warn Americans from getting on the Lusitania. The Germans tried to warn Americans from getting on the ship. But you know what? They were never allowed to put the ad in the paper. And the Germans tried to tell Wilson to warn the American people, and Woodrow Wilson would never see them. In fact, William Jennings Bryan, on page 251 of Griffin's book, he says, William Jennings Bryan was the Secretary of State. It says, George Viriak, who was the editor of a German-owned newspaper at that time, spent April 26th asking the State Department why his advertisement had not been published. Eventually, he managed to obtain an interview with William Jennings Bryan, and pointed out to him that on all but one of her wartime voyages, the Lusitania had carried munitions. Goes on down. Bryan picked up the telephone and cleared the publication of the advertisement. He promised Viriac that he would endeavor to persuade the president publicly to warn Americans not to travel. No such warning was issued by the president. There can be no doubt that President Wilson was told of the character of the cargo destined for the Lusitania. He did nothing, but was to concede on the day he was told of her sinking that his foreknowledge had given him many sleepless hours. So Woodrow Wilson refused to protect Americans who were going to be traveling on the Lusitania. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson's masters told him that those Americans had to die on the Lusitania. Woodrow Wilson was not working for the American people. George Bush is not working for the American people. George Bush is working for his Jesuit masters who control him, just as Woodrow Wilson worked for the Jesuit masters that controlled him. The Lusitania was blown up. From Griffin's book again, page 252, we read this. It says let me get back. When the Lusitania left New York Harbor on May 1, 1915, her orders were to rendezvous with a British destroyer, the Juno, just off the coast of Ireland, so she would have naval protection as she entered hostile waters. When the Lusitania reached the rendezvous point, she was alone, and the captain assumed they had missed each other in the fog. In truth, the Juno had been called out of the area at the last minute and ordered to return to Queenstown. And this was done with the full knowledge that the Lusitania was on a direct course into an area where a German submarine was known to be operating. To make matters worse, the Lusitania had been ordered to cut back on the use of coal, not because of shortages, but because it would be less expensive. Slow targets are much easier to hit. She was required to shut down one of her 4 boilers and was now entering submarine-infested waters at only 75% of her potential speed. So what did Winston Churchill say? He told the Juno, who was going to be the ship that was going to protect the Lusitania, the Juno was withdrawn. And then the Lusitania was to have less coal, or was to use coal, because it would be less expensive, but in reality it was because that would make the ship go slower. And as it was just going nice and easy through the submarine-infested waters, it would be a much easier target. It says, as the Lusitania drew closer to hostile waters, almost everyone knew she was in great danger. Newspapers in London were alive with the story of German warnings. In the map room of the British Admiralty, Winston Churchill watched the play unfold and coldly called the shots. Coldly called the shots. In a book by Joseph M. Kenworthy and George Young called The Freedom of the Seas, it says in 1927 in his book The Freedom of the Seas, he wrote, the Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with her escorts withdrawn. Now, I also found it interesting in this very same book that G. Edward Griffin on page 253 states that the ship, the Lusitania, came directly toward the U-boat, allowing it to full throttle out of her path and swing around for a 90-degree shot at her bow as she passed only 750 yards away. The torpedo struck 9 feet below the water line on the starboard side, slightly forward of the bridge. A second torpedo was readied but not needed. Quickly after the explosion of the impact, there was a second and much larger explosion that literally blew the side off of cargo hold number 2 and started the ship toward the bottom. The Lusitania, one of the largest ships ever built, sank in less than 18 minutes. So what happened? According to G. Edward Griffin, there was one torpedo shot from a German U-boat or a submarine. That was all that was necessary because there were plenty of munitions on board. And after the one torpedo was shot, then there was a huge explosion, and that came from within the Lusitania. So the British had already planned, let one German torpedo hit it, and all the munitions on board are going to be ignited to create the next explosion that will blow it into history. And so what was the result of the attack on the Lusitania in which 195 Americans were killed? There was hysteria in America. How could the Germans do such a thing? What an awful group of people. They're warring against democracy. They're warring against freedom. And I can imagine many flags were made, and bumper stickers with American flags were made, and little flags were made to put on the different kinds of cars that Ford had made up to that point. Not too many, mind you. Maybe they put them on horse-drawn carriages. But they used the attack on the Lusitania to create fervor in America to go to war against Germany. And the attack on the Lusitania was a terrorist attack. They just used a different method at a different time. The controlled press in America blamed Germany. Woodrow Wilson told the American people, we must not let all those American people to have died in vain. In Griffin's book, page 257, we read this. Edward Mandell House, the Jesuit agent in the White House, he said this: America has come to the parting of the ways when she must determine whether she stands for civilized or uncivilized warfare. We can no longer remain neutral spectators. Our action in this crisis will determine the part we play when peace is made, and how far we may influence a settlement for the lasting good of humanity. We're being weighed in the balances, and our position amongst nations is being assessed by mankind. Was that George Bush? It sounds like him, doesn't it? George Bush could have made this very same statement after September 11th, couldn't he? And he said almost the exact same words. And so Winston Churchill, a Jesuit agent in England, Woodrow Wilson, Edward Mandell House, created an outcry in America that took us to war. Now that's how America got into World War I. And World War II isn't any better. After World War I, of course, the League of Nations failed. Congress crushed it. And so there had to be another war. If there was another war, had to be worse than the first one, then the world would cry out again for a united government, a united nations. And so another war was planned, the worst yet, needed to bring about world government. With a world government, the Jesuits could control the world, prepare for the Pope to rule the world as the man of peace from Jerusalem. The thing that's so incredible for us as Seventh-day Adventists today, when we realize from history the purpose of the League of Nations and the United Nations, that these were the Jesuits' plot to take over the world politically and to make it possible to have the Pope rule the world. The thing that's incredible as a Seventh-day Adventist is that in Toronto in the year 2000, Jan Paulson, the General Conference President, invited the Director of the UN, Kofi Annan, to speak. When Kofi Annan said he could not come, he sent one of his assistants. And after the man spoke for, 10, 15 minutes to the people there, Jan Paulson, in response, said, "We are so thankful that so-and-so has come to speak with us because we recognize as Seventh-day Adventists that the UN is God's instrument of peace in the world." That is an endorsement of the Pope. The devil's tool to exalt the papacy and tell the world that the devil as the impersonated Christ is the Son of God. That will be the role of the UN in creating world government, bringing the Pope to Jerusalem, and it will be then from Jerusalem where the Pope will first introduce Christ or the Antichrist to the world. In 1939, the Jesuits are going to try again. They use Adolf Hitler. He invades into Poland, France, the Netherlands, Russia. The world is embroiled in another war, except for one power. And who might that power be that did not join into the war when World War II began? The United States. And why didn't the United States? Because the United States still felt, let the Europeans fight their own wars. Americans didn't want another war. So a year goes by and we're now into 1940. And then another year begins and we get into 1941. Almost 2 years go by. But something is going on behind the scenes. Because Franklin Delano Roosevelt is not his own master. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is working for the papacy and the Jesuit order. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt and most of his helpers are all united in figuring out a way to bring America into World War II. So how are they going to do it? They've got to create something. Something has got to happen where Americans die, and then American public opinion will say, we're going to go after those terrible people. And we're going to save the world for democracy. In Des Griffin's book, Descent into Slavery, we read this, pages 152 and 153. He's quoting from a congressman by the name of Hamilton Fish, who was one of the top Republicans in the United States Congress during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency. Hamilton Fish, quoting from Des Griffin's book, it says this: President Roosevelt's responsibility for goading the Japanese into war by sending a war ultimatum on November 26, 1941, demanding that the Japanese withdraw all troops from Indochina. And China is a historic fact, although a closely guarded secret. FDR's war ultimatum was deliberately withheld from Congress until after Pearl Harbor. All agreed that the ultimatum that FDR made to the Japanese left them no alternative but war. The Japanese would have done almost anything to avoid war with America. The Prime Minister, Prince Kinoe, who was very peacefully inclined, repeatedly requested to come to Washington or Honolulu to meet with President Roosevelt. He was willing to agree to our terms to keep out of war on a modus vivendi, but FDR refused to talk with the Japanese Prime Minister simply because he was determined to get into war with Japan and through that with Germany. The American ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, knew how much the Japanese wanted to maintain peaceful relations and urged such a conference. But FDR and his fellow ardent interventionists used ruses, dodges, and tricks to involve us in a totally unnecessary war. So the Japanese did not want to go to war with America. Any nation with half a brain would not want to go to war with America. And so the Japanese tried every possible maneuver to stay out of war. But FDR would not listen. FDR and his masters said, "We want you to go to war with Japan and with Germany." And that was final. And all the time that FDR was plotting and planning to get America into war with Japan and thus with Germany, guess what he was telling the American people? And I quote from Hamilton Fish's book called FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, quoted from Des Griffin's book on page 153. This is what FDR said: "While I'm talking to you mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I've said this before and I'll say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Now, what do you call that? Anybody who has the Jesuits as their masters lie, use deception, trickery, and they will have their own people annihilated because the end justifies the means. And the man in the White House today has the same mentality as FDR. Same mentality. Franklin Roosevelt was a bold-faced liar. And the President of the United States today is a bold-faced liar. He will lie and trick this nation and will allow and plan and carry out terrorist attacks on this soil to create public opinion that will support what he wants to do. That's the president we have today. Because the masters that controlled Wilson and Roosevelt and Bush are the exact same. The Jesuit order has controlled them all. So FDR goaded the Japanese into war. He pushed them into war. Because FDR's masters wanted a united nations. Now, what do George Bush's masters want today? They want the Pope ruling the world from Jerusalem. And so, a bloodbath has got to be created in the Middle East that will be so bad, it will be so bad, that the world will cry out, and the press will say, we've got to have peace in the Middle East. Who can provide it? And then the Pope will be mentioned as the solution. In every case, folk, and it's a principle of Rome, it's a principle of the Jesuits, they create the problem, and then they give you the solution. You see? Now, I saw, how much time we got? About 5 minutes? Okay. They created the Lusitania attack. The solution was we've got to go to war. They create Pearl Harbor. The solution was we got to go to war. They're going to create another terrorist attack that will then push America and American public opinion. We've got to go to war. Now, when the Lusitania was torpedoed, who was blamed? The Germans. The Germans. And when Pearl Harbor was bombed, who was blamed? The Japanese. And when something else happens where many Americans are going to die, in the climate in which we live today, who's going to be blamed? Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Same plan every single time. Now, let me read something else to you. This is from Eric John Phelps's book, Vatican Assassins, page 484. He says this: by 1941, this is page 484 and 485. By 1941, the Japanese and American governments, controlled by the Jesuits, were ready for war. 25 years of anti-Jap agitation was ready to yield its bitter fruit. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, sinking the majority of the American fleet. According to a Japanese Baptist missionary, the late Daniel Fuji, he told me the attack was provoked by a blockade of Japan called the ABCD line. The American, British, Canadian, and Dutch fleets blocked Japanese shipping, which in international law was an act of war. So the Japanese attacked as FDR knew they were coming and did nothing, thus giving Congress a legitimate reason to declare war. And we read, Roosevelt now knew that Japan planned on attacking the United States, but still he did nothing about warning the American forces at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the naval forces at Pearl Harbor, clearly places the blame for Pearl Harbor's unpreparedness on President Roosevelt. He has written, "We were unready at Pearl Harbor because President Roosevelt's plans required that no word be sent to alert the fleet in Hawaii." And Des Griffin's book, one last time, Descent into Slavery, pages 195, 96, and 97. Any idea of an attack on the U.S. was so ludicrous as to be unworthy of consideration. Japan had no reason to adopt a belligerent attitude toward the United States. America had no reason to adopt an antagonistic attitude towards Japan. But President Roosevelt did have a secret reason for belligerence toward Japan. He'd been placed in power by the internationalists, the Jesuits, and his masters wanted a war with Japan, which had signed a mutual defense pact with Germany. A war would automatically draw the U.S. into full participation in the European theater of war. It would also mean that Japan would be taken care of so that the crown could continue to rule in Asia. I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that right now we are being programmed to accept the fact that the only way to take care of Saddam Hussein is to go to war with Iraq. We're being programmed today to believe that's the only alternative. And then, right now, as we speak, I believe with all my heart, and this is an I believe. This is not a thus saith the Lord. This is a Bill Hughes I believe. Based on history, I believe that the White House and the masters of George Bush and Saddam Hussein, the Jesuit order, are planning some event that will take place in the United States where many, many people in this country will die. And then George Bush will say, see, this event was caused by that madman in Iraq. And then he will have his ammunition to say, now we're going to go to war with this guy. And simultaneously, folks, I believe that after that terrorist attack takes place, that has been planned by American officials under the control of the Jesuits of Rome, war will be started over there. And in the aftermath in this country, I believe Sunday laws will be agitated.